The scent of fried chicken and stale coffee hung thick in the air of the farmer's daughter cafe, a smell as constant as the seasons in Blackwood County. It was the kind of place where deals were made on napkins and reputations were built or broken over a slice of rhubarb pie. On this particular Tuesday in the fall of 1982, the noon rush was in full swing. Every booth was filled with men in seed corn caps and flannel shirts, their talk a low rumble of harvest yields and dropping commodity prices. At a corner table, Silas Blackwood sat alone, nursing a cup of black coffee. His hands, wrapped around the warm ceramic mug, were a roadmap of his life. The knuckles were swollen, the palms thick with calluses, and under each fingernail was a stubborn line of black grease that no amount of lava soap could ever fully scrub away. He wore his usual uniform, faded Lee jeans, worn leather boots, and a denim work shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with the kind of muscle that comes not from a gym, but from wrestling with stubborn machinery and 50-pound sacks of seed. The screen door whined open and slapped shut, and a different kind of man strode in. Harrison Vance. Vance didn't wear flannel, he wore a tailored sport coat over a crisp polo shirt, and his loafers had never seen a speck of mud. He was a landman, a speculator, the kind of farmer who did his work from the climate-controlled cab of a brand-new tractor, or, more often, from behind a polished oak desk at the bank. He moved through the diner like a politician, clapping backs and shaking hands, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that cut through the low grumble of the room. Vance spotted Silas in the corner, and a smirk played on his lips. He changed course, weaving through the tables to stand over Silas's solitary meal of a beef sandwich and potato salad. "Well, well, if it isn't Silas Blackwood," Vance boomed, making sure half the diner could hear him. "Taking a break from tinkering with those museum pieces of yours?" Silas took a slow sip of his coffee before looking up. He didn't rise to the bait. "Afternoon, Harrison." Vance gestured dismissively at Silas's plate. "Still eating the cheap stuff, I see. A man's got to live a little, Silas. Progress, you know? You can't build an empire on a beef sandwich." He pulled out a chair, uninvited, and sat down, leaning forward conspiratorially. "I just closed on the old Miller place. Another 320 acres. Got a brand new Steiger Cougar 3 coming to work it. Duals all around, 300 horsepower. Bet your old 4020 would just lay down and die if it saw that thing coming." A few men at the nearby tables chuckled. They all knew Silas's tractor. It was a 1968 John Deere 4020, a legend in its own right, but ancient by 1982 standards. It had no cab, no radio, no air conditioning. Silas had rebuilt the diesel engine himself twice and knew every bolt and gasket by heart. It was paid for, just like every other piece of equipment on his modest 400 acres. "My 4020 gets the job done," Silas said, his voice even. "Gets the job done?" Vance laughed, a loud braying sound. "Silas, the world is passing you by. We're in the 80s, man. You've got to leverage. You've got to expand. The bank is practically giving money away. I've got a line of credit that would make your head spin. That's how you get ahead. You can't save your way to prosperity." He leaned back, spreading his arms wide. "Look around this room. Every one of these men is trying to grow, trying to build something. And you're still patching tires and rebuilding carburetors like it's 1955. It's pitiful, honestly." The waitress, a young woman named Betty, came over. "Can I get you something, Mr. Vance?" "Just coffee, sweetheart. And put it on his tab," Vance said, winking as he gestured toward Silas. "He looks like he could use the charity." Silas's jaw tightened, but his expression remained a stony mask. He just looked at Vance, his gaze steady. He saw the expensive watch, the soft hands, the easy confidence of a man who'd never had to worry about a check clearing. He saw a man who mistook debt for wealth and noise for substance. The whole room was quiet now, watching the exchange. This wasn't just about two men, it was a clash of two worlds, two philosophies, playing out over chipped coffee mugs and greasy spoons. Vance, feeling his audience, pressed on. "Tell me, Silas, what's it like knowing you'll never own more than that little postage stamp your daddy left you? Knowing that while the rest of us are building legacies, you're just surviving. Doesn't that eat at you?" Silas finished his last bite of sandwich, wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, and finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that Vance's booming tone lacked. "There's a difference between what a man owns, Harrison, and what owns a man. Before we go any further into what happened next in that diner, before I tell you how Silas Blackwood had the last laugh that day, we need to go back. We need to go back more than a decade to understand the path that Silas chose, the one that made him an outcast in an age of easy money and big iron. So let me ask you something. Have you ever known a man like that? A man who stuck to his guns, who refused to take on debt, even when everyone around him was getting rich doing it. A man who the world called a fool, but who deep down you knew was playing a different game entirely. Let me know what you think, because understanding that kind of man is the key to this whole story. The year was 1969. The air was thick with the promise of a new decade. Man had walked on the moon, and back on Earth in the heart of the Corn Belt, it felt like anything was possible. For farmers, this meant bigger, more powerful machines. International Harvester had just rolled out their 66 series tractors, the big red beasts with their black-striped hoods and powerful diesel engines. John Deere was deep into its new generation line, and the sound of a turbocharged diesel pulling a six-bottom plow was the sound of progress. And Harrison Vance was the poster boy for that progress. He'd inherited a decent farm, but with a loan from the Production Credit Association, he'd bought two brand-new IH Farmall 1256s, complete with cabs and factory air. He was the first in the county to have them. He'd drive by Silas's place, where Silas was wrestling with a leaky hydraulic line on his open station 4020, and just lay on the air horn and wave with a pitying smile. Silas's farm was a study in contrasts. It was neat, the fences straight, the barn painted, the yard mowed. But the equipment was old. Alongside the 4020 sat his father's tractor, a 1951 Farmall M, its red paint faded to a dull orange. He used it for planting and cultivating, its narrow front end perfect for navigating the corn rows. His combine was a Gleaner E, a small simple machine that he could fix with a set of wrenches and a prayer. One blistering afternoon in July, the main hydraulic pump on the 4020 gave out. It didn't just leak, it went with a sickening whine and a groan of tortured metal, dumping a 10-gallon trail of High-Guard fluid across the headland as Silas was finishing his last pass cultivating soybeans. He shut it down, the sudden silence of the big six-cylinder diesel ringing in his ears. He climbed down, the sun beating on the back of his neck, and stared at the puddle spreading in the dirt. A new pump from the Deere dealership was $500. $500 he didn't have to spare. He could put it on his account at the dealer, but that was a debt, and Silas hated debt with a cold, hard passion he'd inherited from his father, a man who'd nearly lost everything in the 30s. His father's words were etched into his soul. "Son, the banker is your friend when the sun is shining, but he's the first one to take your coat when it starts to rain." So Silas did what he always did. He walked back to the workshop, a long, low building he'd built himself with salvaged lumber. The place smelled of penetrating oil, hot metal, and stale coffee. Tools lined the walls in perfect order, wrenches sorted by size, sockets in their trays, hammers and pry bars hanging from hooks. He pulled the massive I&T service manual for the 4020 off the shelf, its pages stained with greasy thumbprints. He thumbed through the section on the main hydraulic pump, studying the exploded diagrams. For the next 3 days, that tractor sat in the field like a green monument to failure. Vance drove by twice a day, slowing down each time to get a good look. The news spread through the coffee shop crowd. "Silas's Deere is down, probably for good this time. Heard he can't afford to fix it. Ought to just junk that thing and get a real tractor." Silas ignored them. He drained the remaining fluid, unbolted the heavy pump from the side of the transmission case, and wrestled it onto his workbench. It was a closed-center piston pump, a complex piece of engineering for its time. He carefully disassembled it, laying each part out on a clean rag in the exact order he removed it. The swash plate, the pistons, the valve plate, the seals and O-rings. He found the problem, a catastrophic failure of the main bearing, which had sent metal shavings throughout the entire assembly, scoring the pistons and the valve plate. It was worse than he thought. He spent a day on the phone, calling salvage yards across 3 states. not looking for a whole pump, but for the individual hard parts he needed. He found a valve plate in a yard in Missouri, a set of used pistons from a wrecked tractor in Iowa. He ordered a new bearing and a complete seal kit from the dealer that he would pay for in cash. For the next 2 days, he lived at his workbench. He meticulously cleaned every part in a pan of kerosene, using a brass brush to scrub away years of grime. He took a fine grit stone and patiently lapped the valve plate by hand until it was perfectly smooth, checking it with a straight edge. He measured the piston bores with a micrometer, ensuring the clearance was within the thousandth of an inch tolerance specified in the book. It was slow, tedious work. His wife, Mary, brought him sandwiches and coffee, her face a mask of worry. "Silas, maybe Mr. Vance is right. Maybe we should just get a loan for a newer one." "This tractor is ours, Mary," he'd said, not looking up from his work. "A new one would belong to the bank. There's a difference." He reassembled the pump with the precision of a watchmaker, coating each new seal and O-ring in clean hydraulic fluid. He torqued every bolt to spec, following the sequence in the manual. Finally, he wrestled the rebuilt pump back onto the tractor, connected the lines, and filled the system with fresh fluid. He bled the air out of the system, then climbed into the seat, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned the key. The diesel engine roared to life. He let it warm up, his eyes fixed on the hydraulic lines, searching for leaks. There were none. He tentatively touched the 3-point hitch lever. The big lift arms rose smoothly, powerfully, without a shudder. He engaged the PTO. It spun true. A wave of relief so profound it almost made him dizzy washed over him. He had done it. Total cost, $112 in parts and 3 days of his own sweat and blood. He hadn't saved $500, he had earned it, right here in his own shop. That evening, as the sun set, he finished cultivating the last of the soybeans. The old 4020 ran better than it had in years, the hydraulics silent and strong. As he drove back towards the barn, he saw the headlights of Vance's new 1256 coming down the road. Vance slowed, his window rolling down. Silas expected a jeer, a sarcastic comment. But Vance just stared at the moving tractor, a look of disbelief on his face, and then he sped off, kicking up a cloud of dust. In that moment, Silas hadn't just fixed a pump. He had drawn a line in the sand. The early 1970s arrived like a fever dream for American agriculture. The Russians, facing a massive grain shortfall, started buying American corn and wheat in unprecedented quantities. The deal, which became known as the Great Grain Robbery, sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn, which had been hovering around $1 a bushel, suddenly shot up to $3, then $4. Soybeans followed suit. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling farmers to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. The message from Washington, from the banks, from the equipment dealers was clear: get big or get out. For men like Harrison Vance, it was paradise. The soaring prices meant his loan payments were suddenly easy to make. The rising value of his land meant the bank saw him as a genius, a visionary. They were eager to lend him more, and Vance was eager to borrow. He bought another quarter section, then a full section of prime bottom ground that came up for sale when Old Man Hemmings passed away. He traded in his 2-year-old 1256 for a brand new International Harvester 1466, a black stripe model with a powerful 145 horsepower engine, and then he bought a second one just like it. He built a massive new machine shed, a gleaming monument of steel that dwarfed his house. He bought a new 4-wheel drive Steiger, one of the first in the county, for his fall tillage. His operation was no longer a farm. It was an agribusiness empire, built on a mountain of debt that everyone, including the bankers, saw as a sign of success. The talk at the Farmer's Daughter Cafe changed. It wasn't about fixing things anymore. It was about buying things. Who had the newest, biggest machine? Who had just bought another farm? Vance held court every day at noon, drawing diagrams of his expanding operation on napkins, boasting about his yields, his tax write-offs, his clever financing. He became the undisputed king of Blackwood County agriculture, and Silas Blackwood became the court jester. While Vance and the others were leveraging their assets to buy more land at inflated prices, Silas was doing the opposite. The high grain prices meant he was making more money than he ever had. But instead of borrowing more, he took every extra dollar and paid down the last of his mortgage. In the fall of 1974, he walked into the bank and handed the cashier the final payment on the 400 acres his grandfather had homesteaded. The teller had to call the bank president, Mr. Abernathy, out of his office. Abernathy, a man who had spent the last 3 years signing massive new loans for farmers, looked at Silas with a mixture of confusion and pity. "Well, Silas," Abernathy said, shaking his hand limply, "congratulations, you're a free man. A rare thing these days." But his eyes said something else. They said, "You're a fool. You could have used that land as collateral to buy 1,000 more acres. You're thinking too small." Silas didn't buy a new tractor. He didn't build a new shed. He used the profits from the boom years to systematically improve what he already owned. He tile-drained a wet 40-acre patch in his backfield, a grueling job he did himself with a rented trencher. He rebuilt the engine on his Gleaner combine, replacing the bearings and rings, making it run like new. He bought a used but solid John Deere 7000 planter, the kind with the finger pickup mechanism that was known for its accuracy, and he paid for it in cash. He invested in his soil, adding lime and phosphate based on soil tests, building its long-term health instead of just mining it for short-term profit. His neighbors saw it as a failure of nerve. "Poor Silas," they'd say, shaking their heads. "He's scared. Can't see the opportunity right in front of him." Vance was the most vocal. He'd see Silas out on his old 4020 and yell across the fence line from the air-conditioned cab of his Steiger. "Hey, Blackwood, that thing belongs in a museum. When are you going to join the 20th century?" Even Mary, his wife, began to have her doubts. She saw the wives of other farmers with new cars, new furniture, taking vacations to Florida. They lived in a modest, clean house, but it was the same house Silas had grown up in. One evening, after a church potluck where she'd listened to Vance's wife go on and on about their new in-ground swimming pool, she finally broke. "Silas, are we doing the right thing?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Everyone is moving forward, and it feels like we're standing still. Or even moving backward. The Hendersons just bought the old schoolhouse property. The Schmidts have 2 new combines. And we just paid to have the well cleaned out." Silas sat her down at their simple kitchen table. He took her hands in his. They were soft compared to his, but they were still working hands. "Mary," he said calmly, "I watch those guys. I listen to them talk. They're not talking about farming. They're talking about interest rates, about cash flow, about leverage. They're betting. They're betting that the price of corn will never go down and the price of land will never stop rising. They're betting everything we have, everything their fathers and grandfathers built, on a game being played by bankers in New York and politicians in Washington." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over his fields, dark and quiet under the rising moon. "My father told me about 1929. He said one day everyone was rich, and the next day they were broke. Not because the crops failed, but because the paper failed. The money failed. This boom. It feels the same. It's not real. The only thing that's real is this land, and as long as we own it, truly own it, no banker can take it away from us. Let them have their swimming pools. We have peace of mind. Sooner or later, that's going to be worth more than all the combines in this county." He sounded sure, but as the 70s wore on, it got harder to be sure. By 1979, the boom was still booming. Land that had been $500 an acre was now selling for $2,000, then $3,000. Interest rates were climbing, but so were commodity prices. It seemed the new era of prosperity was permanent. Vance now farmed over 3,000 acres, all of it mortgaged. He was the president of the County Farm Bureau. His picture was in the paper, a symbol of the modern, successful American farmer. One evening in late summer, Silas was in his shop, grinding the valves on the head of the Farmall Ems engine. The radio was on, playing softly in the background. A country song ended, and the news came on. The announcer's voice was grave. He talked about inflation, about the Federal Reserve, about a man named Paul Volcker, who had just been appointed chairman. He mentioned a new policy to aggressively raise interest rates to combat inflation. The prime rate, the announcer said, had just hit an unheard-of 15%. Silas switched off the grinder. The sudden silence was filled by the chirping of crickets outside. He stood there, a valve in his hand, and listened. He didn't understand all the financial terms, the talk of monetary policy and federal funds rates. But he understood the tone in the announcer's voice. It was the sound of a party ending. It was the sound of rain beginning to fall. And he wondered, as he looked out the door of his paid-for workshop, at his paid-for barn and his debt-free fields, just how many of his neighbors had remembered to bring a coat. The summer of 1980 arrived not with a gentle warmth, but with a searing, brassy glare. The sky over Blackwood County turned a pale, hazy blue, and stayed that way. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, the sun beat down, baking the rich black soil into a cracked grey plate. Corn leaves, which should have been broad and green, curled inward on themselves, turning a sickly yellow-grey, a defensive posture against the relentless evaporation. They looked like tightly rolled cigars, a field of silent screams. For Silas, it was a time for conservation. He cultivated only in the cool of the early morning or the late evening, trying to preserve what little moisture remained in the ground. His old Farmall M, with its light footprint, barely disturbed the soil. He watched the horizon, sniffed the air, and knew in his bones this was a bad one. But his costs were low. The fuel for his tractors was his main expense, and his old, efficient diesels sipped it compared to the big, thirsty, turbocharged engines his neighbors ran. He had no payments to make, no notes coming due. The drought would hurt his yield, but it wouldn't break him. For Harrison Vance, the drought was a tightening noose. His 3,000 acres drank diesel fuel like a thirsty giant. His massive four-wheel drive Steiger, pulling a 30-foot disc, burned 30 gallons an hour just to turn the soil to dust. Worse, the interest on his operating loans was now variable, tied to the prime rate that Volker's Fed kept pushing higher. What had been a manageable 8% 2 years ago was now 16%, then 18%. The monthly interest payment alone was more than Silas's entire farm was worth a decade earlier. The first real crack in Vance's empire appeared in the blistering heat of late July. He was trying to finish his summer tillage, a practice Silas had abandoned as wasteful, when the big Cummins 855 diesel in his Steiger Cougar 3 let go. There was no warning, just a sharp metallic bang that echoed across the dry fields, followed by a plume of oily blue smoke and the sickening sound of grinding, seizing metal. A connecting rod had snapped, punching a fist-sized hole clean through the side of the engine block. The giant green tractor coasted to a silent, smoking halt in a cloud of its own ruin. Vance had to call the dealership in the next county. They sent a lowboy trailer and their head mechanic, a grim-faced man named Gus. Silas saw them haul the crippled machine down the road, looking like a captured beast on its way to slaughter. A few days later, Silas was at the parts counter at the local dealership, picking up a new set of sickle sections for his gleaner, when Vance stormed in. His face was flushed, his usual smooth confidence replaced by a raw, ragged anger. "What do you mean, $50,000? Vance's voice, usually so commanding, was a strained roar. "For a remanufactured engine, that's robbery." Gus, the mechanic, was there, wiping his hands on a red rag. He didn't flinch. "That's the price, Harrison. Engine, labor, and the 2 weeks it'll take to get it here and put it in. Your whole hydraulic system is full of metal shavings, too. We've got to flush everything, replace all the filters, check the pumps. You're lucky it didn't take out the transmission." "I need that tractor now." Vance slammed his palm on the counter. "I can't wait 2 weeks." "Nobody's got an 855 Cummins just sitting on a shelf," Gus said flatly. "And nobody works for free. You want it, you pay for it. Cash or a purchase order from your bank." Vance's face went pale. The mention of the bank hit a nerve. He sputtered for a moment, then turned and stalked out, the screen door slamming behind him. The men at the counter fell silent, exchanging knowing glances. $50,000. It was a staggering sum, more than the cost of a whole farm not long ago. For Vance, it wasn't just a repair bill, it was a cash flow crisis, a demand for real money in a world where he had only ever dealt in paper and credit. Silas paid for his sickle sections, $12.50 in cash, and left quietly. He went home, and that afternoon in his own shop, he did the pre-harvest maintenance on his Gleaner E. He replaced the worn sections on the cutter bar, greased every fitting, and checked the tension on the simple rattle chain final drives. As he worked, he thought about Vance's broken Steiger. The engine was a marvel of modern engineering, powerful and complex. But its complexity was its weakness. When it failed, its owner was helpless, completely dependent on a dealer and a supply chain that stretched 1,000 miles away. Silas's old Alice Chalmers engine in the Gleaner was simple. He could overhaul it himself on his workbench in 2 days, if he had to. In this new, brittle world, Silas was beginning to realize that his greatest asset wasn't his land or his machinery, it was his independence. The fall of 1981 was a harvest of reckoning. The drought had slashed yields across the county. Anyone who had borrowed against the promise of 200 bushel corn was now facing a devastating shortfall. To make matters worse, the grain embargo against the Soviet Union had cratered the market. Prices fell through the floor. The combination was lethal. It was like borrowing money for a trip to the moon and having your rocket explode on the launch pad. The bankers who had been so eager to lend money just a few years before now became cold-eyed accountants. Their phone calls to men like Harrison Vance were no longer friendly chats. They were terse demands for payment. The phrase restructuring the debt became a euphemism for a slow public execution. Vance was forced to sell off a section of his newest land at a loss just to cover his operating loan from the previous year. The sale barely made a dent in his long-term debt, and it sent a shockwave through the community. Land values, which had seemed to defy gravity, suddenly began to plummet. Everyone who had used their inflated land equity as collateral was suddenly technically insolvent. The farm auctions started the following winter. First, it was the young guys, the ones who had jumped in head first at the peak of the boom. Then it was the established families, men who were considered pillars of the community. Silas and Mary would see the sale bills posted at the post office, stark black and white flyers that listed a man's entire life, his dreams and his labor, in cold, hard inventory. One IH 1486 tractor, one JD 7720 combine, 640 acres of prime bottom ground. It felt like reading obituaries. Vance fought it for as long as he could. He sold more land. He sold his second, smaller Steiger. He let his hired man go. He and his wife tried to run the whole operation themselves, their faces etched with a permanent, weary desperation. The gleaming machine shed started to look shabby. The yard went unmowed, and the new equipment sat out in the weather, its paint fading. The empire was crumbling. By the fall of 1982, the end was near. The bank had called Vance's notes. His final auction was scheduled for the first Saturday in November. The week before the sale, the whole county was buzzing with the news. It was the biggest foreclosure in Blackwood County history. A titan was falling. It was that Tuesday, 4 days before the auction, that Silas found himself at his usual corner table in the Farmer's Daughter Cafe. He was just finishing his beef sandwich when the door opened and Harrison Vance walked in. Vance looked terrible. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his face was gaunt, and his eyes had the haunted, hollow look of a man who hadn't slept in weeks. But the bravado, the sheer, stubborn pride was still there. It was all he had left. He saw Silas, and for a moment a flicker of the old arrogance returned. It was a reflex, a desperate attempt to pretend that nothing had changed, that he was still the king and Silas was still the fool. He strode over to the table, and the whole diner went quiet as he delivered his lines about museum pieces and building empires, the words sounding hollow and pathetic in the charged silence of the room. He ordered his coffee, put it on Silas's tab as a final feeble act of dominance, and then he delivered the knockout blow he thought he still possessed. "Tell me, Silas, what's it like knowing you'll never own more than that little postage stamp your daddy left you? Knowing that while the rest of us are building legacies, you're just surviving. Doesn't that eat at you?" Silas took a slow, deliberate breath. He looked at this broken man, this shell of confidence, and he felt not anger, not triumph, but a profound and weary pity. He finished his sandwich, wiped his mouth, and gave the reply that had been forming in his mind for over a decade. "There's a difference between what a man owns, Harrison, and what owns a man." Vance stared, his mouth slightly agape, the words hanging in the air between them. He had no response. The simple truth of the statement had disarmed him completely. For the first time, in front of the whole town, Harrison Vance was speechless. Silas pushed his chair back and stood up. He reached into the pocket of his Lee jeans and pulled out a thick roll of bills held together with a rubber band. It was cash from the sale of his soybeans, money that belonged to him, not to a bank. He peeled off a $5 bill and laid it on the table for his lunch and Vance's coffee. Then he walked over to the counter where Betty, the waitress, was watching with wide eyes. "Betty," Silas said, his voice calm and clear, carrying through the silent diner. "How much to cover everyone's ticket?" "All of them." Betty fumbled with her order pad, her hands shaking as she tallied up the checks from the dozen or so occupied tables. $68.40, Mr. Blackwood." Silas counted out 3 crisp $20 bills and a 10 from his roll and laid them on the counter. "Keep the change, Betty. Tell everyone lunch is on me today." He turned, not looking at Vance, and addressed the room. "Gentlemen," he said, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the men who had once mocked him, "times are hard. We all need to stick together." Then he walked out the door, letting the screen slap shut behind him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He hadn't just bought lunch, he had bought back his own name. In a world drowning in debt, the quiet farmer with the roll of cash in his pocket was the richest man in the room. He was free. The day of the Vance auction was cold and grey, with a sharp wind that promised an early winter. The farmyard was packed with pickup trucks and cars, a grim congregation gathered for the final rites. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant, a strange, hypnotic song of financial ruin, echoed off the big steel machine shed. Silas was there, standing at the back of the crowd, his collar turned up against the wind. He wasn't there to gloat or to pick over the bones. He was there to bear witness. He watched as Vance's life was sold off, piece by piece. The big IH-1466 tractors, barely 10 years old, sold for a fraction of what he'd paid for them. The massive disc, the planter, the grain trucks, all went for pennies on the dollar to men who paid in cash. Vance and his wife stood on the porch of their house, watching in silence, their faces as grey as the November sky. They looked like ghosts at their own funeral. When the auctioneer moved to the land, the crowd grew quiet and tense. This was the heart of it. The 3,000 acres were being sold in parcels. The big prime sections were bought up by an out-of-state insurance company, an invisible corporation that would never set foot on the soil. Finally, the auctioneer came to the last parcel. Lot number 12, folks, the home quarter. 160 acres with house, barn, and all outbuildings. This was the original Vance farm, the land Harrison had inherited from his father. It was the heart of the home he had lost. The bidding started low. Silas saw Vance's wife turn away, burying her face in her husband's shoulder. Silas stepped forward. 20,000, he said, his voice firm. Another farmer bid 21. 25, Silas said immediately. The bidding stalled. In this broken economy, even that was a lot of cash. The auctioneer looked around. 25,000 once. 25,000 twice. Sold. To Silas Blackwood for $25,000. A murmur went through the crowd. Silas Blackwood, the man everyone thought was poor, had just bought the Vance home place. After the auction was over, while people were settling their accounts, Silas walked up the steps to the porch where Harrison Vance and his wife were standing, looking utterly defeated. Vance wouldn't look at him. "Come to kick me while I'm down, Blackwood, to get the last laugh." "No, Harrison," Silas said quietly. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It was a simple lease agreement he'd had the town lawyer draw up the day before. "I came to give you this." Vance took it, his hand trembling. He read it, then read it again, his eyes wide with disbelief. You're leasing it back to me, for $1 a year." "It's your home, Harrison," Silas said. "A man ought to be able to live in his own home. You can farm it, take the profit. Just keep the taxes paid and the place up. That's all I ask." Vance's wife started to cry, quiet, grateful sobs. Harrison looked up at Silas, his face a wreck of confusion, shame, and a dawning, painful gratitude. "Why?" he choked out. "After everything, all the years I gave you hell, why?" Silas looked out over the fields, the same fields he'd looked at his whole life. "Because this county has lost enough good farmers," he said. "It's time we started helping each other instead of trying to beat each other. The bankers have won enough." He turned to leave, then paused. "And Harrison." If that old Ford pickup of yours gives you trouble, bring it by the shop. We'll get it running right. Life in Blackwood County settled into a new, harder reality. The flashy boom years were gone, replaced by a quiet, frugal determination. The men at the Farmer's Daughter Cafe no longer talked about lines of credit and new equipment. They talked about repair tips, about where to find used parts, about how to make an old machine last one more season. And more often than not, they would end their conversations with, "You should go ask Silas. He'll know how to fix it." Silas's farm became a kind of anchor in the community. His workshop, once a symbol of his backwardness, was now a sanctuary for his neighbors. He never charged for his advice, and he only asked for the cost of parts if he helped with a repair. He didn't get rich, but he earned something far more valuable: respect. He became the man his father had always taught him to be, steady, self-reliant, and generous in his own quiet way. Harrison Vance stayed on his home place, a changed and humbled man. He and Silas never became close friends, but a deep, unspoken understanding passed between them whenever they met on the road. A nod of acknowledgement for the hard lessons learned. Years passed. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. The farm economy slowly healed. Silas and Mary grew old together. Their children grew up and moved away, but their youngest grandson, a boy named Jake, spent every summer on the farm. One hot afternoon in what must have been the late 90s, Silas, now a man in his late 60s, with hands gnarled by arthritis but still surprisingly strong, was in the shop with 12-year-old Jake. They were working on the 4020. It was the same tractor, its green paint faded and worn smooth in places from decades of use. They were doing a simple tune-up, replacing the fuel injectors. "Grandpa?" Jake asked, handing his grandfather a wrench. "Why do we still use this old tractor? Dad says we could afford a new one now, one with a cab and air conditioning and a radio." Silas took the wrench and carefully tightened a fuel line. He stopped and looked at the boy. He saw the future in his grandson's curious eyes. He wiped a smear of grease from his forearm and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Jake," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "this tractor taught me the most important lesson I ever learned. It's not about having the newest or the biggest thing. It's about understanding what you have, down to the last bolt. It's about being able to fix it with your own two hands when it breaks." He gestured around the shop, at the rows of tools on the wall, at the old Farmall M sitting in the corner. "This world will try to sell you a million things. It will tell you to borrow money to buy them, to get bigger, to get faster. It will try to make you dependent on people you've never met, in places you've never been. But freedom, real freedom, isn't in any of that." He tapped the fender of the old John Deere. "It's right here. It's in owning what you have, free and clear. It's in knowing that when the storms come, and they always come, you're standing on your own ground, on a foundation you built yourself. It's not about being rich, son. It's about being free." The boy looked from his grandfather's wise, weathered face to the old green tractor, and for the first time, he didn't see a museum piece. He saw a legacy. He saw a quiet, unshakable strength. And in the cool, dusty air of the workshop, filled with the scent of old oil and honest work, he began to understand.